Hello, my name is Andy Tidy and welcome back to another edition of Canal Hunter, where we go in search of some of CRT's reservoirs. In my last reservoir hunt we looked at the mighty Chase Water Reservoir, one of the largest in the countries. And this time, by way of a bookend, we're going to look at something completely different. And I'm bringing you here to Sneyd Junction. Sneyd Junction is the home of the Sneyd Reservoir, a long abandoned structure, and it's up there beyond the locks. Not only is this reservoir smaller, it's abandoned and it's dewatered, but it's quite different and quite unique in its own distinct way. One of the interesting features about this reservoir, because it's been dewatered, is we can actually climb inside its earth ramparts and we can see the thing from a fisheye view. Now, before we go up there, I think you probably need to know a little bit about the history of the reservoir in the context of the canal it was built to serve. The first phase of the Worley-Nessington was built in 1794 and it connected Wolverhampton through to the coal mines in this area around by Sneed. It was 6.5 miles long, there or thereabouts, and in its initial phase it reached just here at the bottom lock of the Worley Bank branch. Back at that time, what is now the main line out to Walsall and then on to Lichfield was actually just a short branch canal, and that went as far as Birchills. Initially that wasn't very successful, and there are records that the branch was actually dewatered and left empty for quite a while until the further extension was built. Anyhow, these days the gap between locks 1 and 2 does still look distinctly like a canal. This slightly later addition to the Worley-Nessington Canal was built to access the collieries in Worley Bank, that's near Cheslin Hay. The extension of the canal to Worley Bank was completed in 1798, just a few years later, and it involved the construction of the 5 locks that run under what is now Vernon Way. And the trouble with starting to move the canal up to a higher level at 503 feet is the need for a reserve of water. And that's where the reservoir came in, just here. This is the southern entrance to the Sneyd Reservoir, and the old pumping engine that was associated with this canal sat in the bank just in these trees. And in some ways it's the pumping engine and the water circulation process which makes this reservoir most interesting. Now, I've been back to Sneyd on several occasions, but it always leaves unanswered questions. And I'd like to try and untangle a few of those in this episode. So this was the site of the old pumping engine that stood on the end of the reservoir. You see some debris, and at the far side of a canal inlet there is a valve or a little tunnel. If you look closely you can see all the way down to the bottom end, and I believe that that was probably the water inlet from the pumping station. And what's most unusual about the Sneyd Reservoir and its associated pumping engine is that along the top of the bank there is the line of an old canal. This is a canal arm itself. It's all a bit chaotic these days, but this is where they used to bring the coal in to power the pumping engine. You can see the edges of the canal still exist, and if you climb down into the water channel itself you can still find all the old coping stones. Now, I don't know many reservoirs which have a canal channel that runs right along the embankment edge. It must have made the embankment very, very thick and very large. What I don't really understand is why they built the pumping station right out here on the very end of the embankment. I mean, it meant that the embankment had to be impossibly thick. Why not build the pumping engine up at the top end near where the ground level is closest to the water level? Now, I'd like to try and find some answers to that in the undergrowth. We'll see how we get on. Now we're doing our walk around Sneyd Reservoir in an anti-clockwise direction. So we're starting off by following the line of the supply channel which brought the coal into the pumping station. And my guess is that when the pumping station was operational, its first purpose was to pump water up from Sneyd and bring it into the Canal channel here, which feeds all the way along to the north to the top lock. Up beyond the flight of 5 locks, the canal looks reasonably canal-like. Still got some water in after the winter rains, and it drains away into the remains of the top lock, which has now been buried. Now, having consulted the old maps, it suggests that here at the top lock the channel divided into two. The boats went through this way, but to deliver coal you went through this way. And looking down at the detail of the brickwork, you can see that there is an angular point down here. That's a cutwater. So boats really could go to the locks one way and out to the pumping station on the other. So that's the direction that we know we need to follow. Now, back in 1972, the reports that the locks were all still here but very weeded up. But by 1974, the whole site had been sold to the local development corporation. So there's not an awful lot left, except a bit of a ditch and a little bit of brickwork. I'll head down and see if I can pick up any more trail of this old coal supply route. At this time of year, the area of the lock is pretty distinct by this darkened section of grass. The grass is growing stronger in the site of the old lock. In fact, you can still see the edgings of the lock down in the grass. And the purpose of today's expedition is to find out more about this other channel. Well, if I'm honest, this other channel seems to have been largely filled in. But where you fill in an old channel, you quite often have to leave something for drainage. And here we find a big pipe. And I would suspect that this was built to carry the surplus water that came from surface water further up the canal around down the hill. And there the story comes to an end. And if I follow the line of the pipe, it seems to head very definitely down in this direction towards the reservoir itself. Now, I'd say that that is the old outfall into the reservoir from the upper canal. So when the upper canal had plenty of water coming down in the winter, this is the way that the reservoir would fill up. These days the water level in Sneyd Reservoir is way down on its operational level, probably 30 feet below its original summit up here on the 503-foot rim. Today there seems to be almost no water flowing into it, so I guess the waters that remain come from the rain or from the runoff from the M6, which is right beside me, and you can probably hear it roaring away in the background. Now, it's important to recognise just how high up we are. We're at 503 feet. That's higher than the Pennine Summit crossing for the Leeds-Liverpool as it crosses the Pennine Ridge. So it really is high, and there is no surface water. But when they did get surplus surface water in the winter time, the overflow from the reservoir would be down here on the southern bank, and this is the old outfall. When the children used to play here in the 1970s, they referred to it as the Dragon's Den, and apparently at the time the channel that led off from the weir down to the outside world was still visible, and they could scramble up and down it. These days it's all been filled in and made safe, but the top of the Dragon's Den still remains to be found. Anyhow, onwards and round to the other side of the reservoir. And running alongside the southern earthworks, there appears to be a second channel. That's probably the overflow channel. Now this is what appears to be the bottom opening for the water spillway coming from the pumping station down into the reservoir. This isn't the bottom end of it, it's just a section that's been knocked open. I'll go a little bit further down and see if I can find the bottom. Well, if there is any more of the water inlet channel, I'm not going to find it. It's covered in brambles and is very, very boggy. So after having had a good scramble through the undergrowth, my working assumptions about the mechanisms of the pumping system in this area are as follows. Generally, the pumping station would have been used to pump water up from the canal below. It would have dropped it straight into the navigation channel beside it and filled up the canal. When the canal was full, the surplus water would run down through the fill tunnel and fill up here in the basin of the reservoir. But if the canal was short of water and the reservoir was full, they could use the pumping engine to pump water out of the reservoir basin and into the canal. And on the rare occasions that there was too much water in the canal and in the reservoir, then the water simply flowed out through the weir at the far end of the reservoir on the south bank and down through a channel and out into the canal and the drainage systems off to the south. Now, all the reports from people who lived here in the 1970s were that this was a child's paradise. They used to play in here, they used to play in the Dragon's Den and crawl through the tubes. They used to play around on the remains of the pumping station, which they called the fort. They said it had like a circular gun emplacement on the top. I suspect that was the chimney. But that's not quite all of the canal up here at Sneed. There was also the Essington branch, which ran up to Lord Vernon's coal works, about a mile to the north. His short 3/4 of a mile canal wasn't a success, plagued by water shortages, and no sooner had it been built than Lord Vernon was agitating to have a railway built as an alternative. These days, his name lives on in the fame of the road name, which now occupies the sites of locks 2, 3 and 4. And so as the mines fell silent up on Worley Bank, so the need for the Worley Bank branch came to an end. The canal was formally abandoned in 1954 and then gently languished in varying states of decrepitude through until 1973. At which time British Waterways Board sold it to Sneed Developments. At the same time, nearly all the built remains were demolished. And what we have left are what you see today. Well, that's it for this brief whistle-stop tour around Sneyd Reservoir. These days it's just a local nature reserve, known only to a handful of locals and dog walkers. But if you get a chance, it's a great little canal heritage site. You've got locks, you've got an old canal, and you've got some odd bits of masonry and artefacts. So that's it for this edition of Canal Hunter. Hope you enjoy it. I'll see you soon, and cheerio.